Okay.
If that comes back on, we can go over to him.
Okay, well, let us begin then. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this important webinar. We belong to a coalition of Oromo advocacy and human rights groups, largely based in North America and Europe, with, of course, close ties to Oromia and Ethiopia. Between us, we have decades, if not centuries, of lived experience in Oromia and elsewhere working on Oromo issues. Our member organizations include groups with close ties to Oromo communities in the USA, the Oromo Legacy Leadership and Advocacy Association, the Oromo Global Forum, and in Canada, the Union of Oromo Communities of Canada. They include Oromo advocacy organizations such as the Oromo Advocacy Alliance, the Oromo Professionals Group, and organizations reporting on human rights abuses, including the Oromia Support Group, which has been doing so since 1994 and has now published 60 reports on human rights abuses in Ethiopia. The group also includes individuals who are concerned about and informed about human rights abuses in Ethiopia, some of whom are closely connected to human rights defenders back home in Oromia. Indeed, we first came together 1.5 years ago to publicize a report from human rights defenders in West Wolga. Now, as well as collaborating on data collection, we've discussed and deliberated on ways to get the unsung stories of Oromia and Ethiopia told. Our first major collaboration was to crystallize and to define recommendations for a ceasefire and dialogue on the 18th of August, which we published last year. The coalition made a major contribution to the consensus document from 60+ Oromo organizations on Oromo national interests, which was published in January of this year, including on the Addis Standard website. We've written papers on hate speech in Ethiopia, the massacre of Karayu religious and spiritual leaders 1 year ago yesterday, the facts behind the disinformation and propaganda surrounding the massacre of civilians in Tole in July. The opportunity for effective action, which is within reach if the current legislation goes through, is huge. The proposed US legislation to investigate abuses across the whole of Ethiopia and to gain access throughout, for aid to get through and for impunity for human rights abuses to end, this legislation could at least help bring civil liberties back to Ethiopia. More information on the background to Ethiopia's woes will be given at Tuesday's webinar at the same time as this. We look forward to seeing you there. Meanwhile, I would like to hand over to our two main speakers this morning. And Ebisa, are you available to do the introductions now?
Ebisa just returned.
Okay, in that case,
I'll join through the phone.
Okay, would you like to introduce Alex Devarman in that case, please, Ebisa?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was having technical difficulty with this phone. Okay, thank you very much. Alex Duval is not new to the Oromo scene or the Ethiopia scene. He's been with us at OSA before. We have discussed in depth many relevant critical issues. However, let me introduce him properly. He's a scholar and researcher at the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts University. He has authored many books. He has written critical articles, and he has specialized in the Horn of Africa politics. And so his work dates back decades, researching the Horn of Africa, and he's a well-known expert. And today he's with us to discuss the current situation in Ethiopia, what has transpired. And please help me welcome Professor Alex Duval to the stage for us. Is he there?
I am here. I'm.
All right. Great to see you again, Professor Alex Duval.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, now I can start my video and you will be able to see me. So it's a pleasure to be with you. It's of course a still a very difficult time, difficult and painful time in Ethiopia. A time at which I hope we can still focus upon the possibilities of peace. I have, as you will see, from almost 100 years ago, a poster on my wall, which is one of the defining themes of the organization I had, the World Peace Foundation. Don't be ashamed to stand for peace. And one of the features of Ethiopia, and particularly the sort of the highland culture of Amhara and Tigray, is that those who talk about peace, it's assumed they're talking about peace because they are losing, and and there is this deep toxic macho culture that if you are winning, you impose on the others, and if you are losing, you must plead. There is no real concept in that political tradition of a peace that provides for all to win. And what I want to speak about just for a few minutes is the agreement on a permanent cessation of hostilities leading to a lasting peace between the federal government and the TPLF, which may or may not live up to its billing. So there would. I don't need to tell you about the background to the war, but the expectations of a real peace negotiations resulting in an agreement. As of 5 weeks ago, those expectations were extremely low. The African Union, which convened the parties, did so really as the messenger boy of Prime Minister Abiy, on the assumption that a military solution would be achieved either before the talks convened or while they were in session. And President Obasanjo, who has essentially served the agenda of the federal government, had more or less in his pocket a copy of the surrender document from the 1970 end of the Biafran War, which he himself witnessed. He was the colonel in the Nigerian Federal Army who received the surrender on behalf of the Biafrans. A very short document, just 4 sentences, basically saying the people and forces of Biafra are henceforth loyal citizens of the Federal Republic. They will lay down their arms without condition, and the Republic of Biafra ceases to exist. And the draft agreement that the federal government came with to Pretoria for these talks was essentially drawn from that template. Defying the most pessimistic assumptions, the Tigrayans actually came and took the initiative to agree to a peace settlement. And they were able to do so because they were still in active resistance. But the deal they made was very disadvantageous, reflecting the strategic calculus, which I'll come on to in a moment, and the fact that in any negotiation of this type, if you come and you say, I will not leave this room without a deal, you're at a negotiating disadvantage. The other side will exploit that to force concessions out of you, which is exactly what happened. So the core deal made is that humanitarian aid will flow to Tigray in exchange for Tigray accepting subordinate political status with respect to the federal government, including the dismantling of the TPLF-run government of Tigray. So it is a political surrender in return for a humanitarian deal with security details to be worked out. According to the agreement, Eritrea and Amhara region special forces, though not named as such in the document, will withdraw and Tigray will disarm. The rest is detail. The security arrangements in the original Pretoria document are entirely impracticable. There's no way they could be implemented in practice. They are fantastical. As developed in the subsequent Nairobi document that came out 10 days later on November 12th, you see the beginnings of something more practicable, which is a joint committee run by the head of the Tigray Defense Forces and the head of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces to jointly determine how the security arrangements will work and to have a disarmament process concurrent with the withdrawal of Eritrea and non-ENDF forces. And because the TDF is still very much present on the ground, is in fact the dominant force, in fact, those joint arrangements will be more equitable and one hopes more practicable. Now, the rationale for reaching agreement was that the war was leading to two things: the destruction of the people of Tigray and the destruction of the state of Ethiopia. Both were heading down this track. The question was which would reach its destination first. Now, the level of fatalities are quite shocking. Of the pre-war population of Tigray of about 6 million, perhaps 10% had perished in the last 2 years from a combination of hunger, disease, and atrocity. In addition to which, absolutely stupendous levels of battlefield casualties. The Ethiopian Chief of Staff, Birhanu Jula, was caught in an off-guarded moment, admitting that 136,000 soldiers had been killed, that is, killed from his army alone in fighting between the 24th of August and the 2nd of November. And that excludes the Amhara militia, the Eritreans, and the Tigrayans. He earlier conceded privately that in the first 8 months of the war, he'd lost more than 140,000 killed. So the battlefield fatalities alone are probably well over 500,000. So we're talking about more than 1 million deaths. And the rationale for the way in which the war was fought on the federal stroke Eritrean side was that Ethiopia, because of its demographic size, could absorb that level of losses and still, quotes, win. So they were prepared to sacrifice that number of young people on the battlefield in order to prevail. It's really quite shocking. And the Ethiopian army no longer resembles an army. Ethiopia is bankrupt, it's falling apart. And yet the leadership in Ethiopia and the leadership in Asmara were quite content to see this happen, or at least what did not have, on the point of, from the vantage point of Addis, did not have an overriding reason to stop it from happening. We all know that the Eritreans were quite happy to see it happen. So the Tigrayans, essentially, in order to save their people, made that act of political surrender. The TPLF had also dismally failed politically, both internally in terms of consulting its own people, and also in terms of constructing alliances with others elsewhere in Ethiopia. So that we saw this pattern over the last nearly 2 years, whereby the Tigrayan Defense Forces won battles and the TPLF lost any political advantage that might have accrued from that battlefield success. So we have an agreement that is essentially an adapted surrender agreement. It's politically, it's not even a political agreement. It is merely an end to the fighting, and the fighting has indeed largely ended. It's not clear whether that's for good or not. But normally what one would hope for in these circumstances is that the principles on each side would have a core political agreement worked out between them, and then they would develop the document with all the details. In this case, it's the other way around. There is no core political agreement. That now needs to be worked out in the next stage. There is just, as it were, a peace, if we can call it peace, or a cessation of hostilities brought about by a combination of exhaustion and the two sides contemplating the abyss and not wanting to plunge into it. So some of the issues that arise, the first is that, which is a very fundamental political issue, is whether the Pretoria Agreement, now a month old, whether this nullifies the 2018 Asmara Pact between Isaias Afwerki and Abiy Ahmed, or whether that deal, which is of course secret, we don't know what's in it, although we can guess, whether that deal remains in force. And presumably Abiy wants that deal to remain in force. He presumably thinks that he has the political skill, the charisma, etc., to manage both Mekelle and Asmara at the same time. I think that's improbable. And even if the Eritreans were to withdraw, the question of withdraw from Tigray, the question of the Eritrean presence and agenda elsewhere in Ethiopia, particularly its alliance with the Amhara and its presence in Addis Ababa, would remain unresolved. The immediate deliverable is supposed to be humanitarian assistance. That has not been forthcoming at scale. One of the dismal realities of the last couple of years has been the readiness of the international community to witness starvation being used as a weapon of war at scale and do nothing to stop it, next to nothing to stop it, indeed to connive with it. And what we've seen over the last month is business as usual, really a trickle of aid, a readiness to allow the administration, the authorization of international humanitarian assistance to be used in a tactical manner by Addis Ababa to gain other other concessions, not necessarily minor, they may be major. The other notable weaknesses in the agreement include the provisions for protection of civilians, which are really zero. The monitoring and verification mechanism, which is to be discussed and negotiated in Nairobi in a week's time, and the lack of serious measures for accountability for gross violations. There's also no basic security guarantees. The essential mechanisms for a workable peace agreement remain to be constructed. So it's quite an experiment in peacemaking. So above all, it's a real regression from the African Union's norms and principles, which if we look at how the African Union was operating 10 years ago in, say, Sudan, we see a real commitment to democracy, human rights, transparency, monitoring, etc., etc. All of that has gone out of the window. So the agreement risks failure for a number of reasons, including Eritrea's role as a spoiler, conflicts, unresolved conflicts with Amhara over Western Tigray. I should say one of perhaps the main political gain that the Tigrayans got was the inclusion of respect for the constitution. One of the successes, the diplomatic successes, public relations successes of Abiy is to argue, to present to the world the idea that he is upholding the constitution, and the Tigrayans and others are challenging it. Whereas, of course, it's the other way around. It's the so-called rebels who are fighting to uphold the constitution, while he wanted to dismantle it. And so he was in a bit of a corner when the Tigrayans insisted constitution be upheld. And of course, this is going to cause some discontent among the Amharas. The way that Abiy is managing or failing to manage the multiple political pressures, he can be compared in some respects to the late president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who described governing Yemen as dancing on the heads of snakes, with the difference in this case that Abiy is not such a good dancer, and he is also feeding those snakes himself. And then the last key point that I want to make here is that this agreement, of course, says nothing about the rest of Ethiopia, and especially nothing about Oromia. And it would be a calamity if peace, so-called, in Tigray were to be the prelude to intensified war in Oromia. And there are already signs that this may be a possible scenario. And I think this places a particular responsibility on the international community, which has preferred to close its eyes to what is going on, to support Abiy, in my view, mistaking continuity of a head of government with stability of a state, which are two very different things, and to focus on the war in Tigray to the detriment of all the other issues. And there will, I fear, be a switch off in attention. The idea being this problem is now solved, let us turn our attention elsewhere, but not to other problems in Ethiopia. And I think a particular responsibility then falls on Kenya, whose former president Uhuru Kenyatta took a lead in actually making this agreement real and in following up on it, and who has a clear vested interest as a neighbor of Ethiopia and as a country with a substantial Oromo population itself, has a clear interest in moving to the next stage, which would include peace with justice and democracy in Oromia. Let me stop at that point.
Busy, you're muted.
Okay, there you go. Thank you so much, Professor Alex Dwall. That was very insightful. I hope you stay with us. We do have a little Q&A later on to ask a few questions from your presentation and maybe what may happen next. Thank you to my next speaker is Professor Eskiel Kabisa. Ready for us?
I am.
All right, thank you so much. Let me introduce Professor Eskiel Kabisa. He's a veteran human rights advocate. He's a professor at the Kettering University at the Political Science Department. He has written several articles. He has been at the helm of democratic change for a very long time. He had appeared on many medias, and he continues to advocate for peace and democracy and stability in the region. So let me welcome him to give us a little view on what is happening on the Oromia side in the country as well. Professor Eskiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ebisa, and everyone else, and for the opportunity to speak about the hidden war in Oromia. I guess as Professor Dewal just said, the guns may have fallen silent in Tigray. The Tigray Defense Forces fought heroically against the coalition forces of the Asmara-Addis Amhara axis for 69 days. But the nearly 800 days of siege, perhaps the longest siege of the whole region, in history, worked. Tigray's combatants depleted their capabilities, war-making capabilities. They depleted their supplies to continue the resistance, and faced with humiliation and possible extermination, TPLF leaders chose capitulation. So I agree with that statement that Professor Dewal made. So for now, to use the term from the First World War, all is quiet on the northern front. but the Ethiopian civil war, and for me that is really what is happening in the civil war, and the Tigray war is an integral part of that civil war. It has escalated in Oromia. This is not a surprise for many of us that observe this development closely, because the theater of operation has seesawed between Oromia and Tigray over the course of the civil war. So not surprisingly, soon after the Pretoria Accord on cessation of hostilities was signed on November the 2nd, the pendulum swung back to Oromia. The Ethiopian security apparatus and the weapons systems in its arsenal were turned against the Oromo Liberation Army in Oromia, and the drones that had been pounding Tigray are now crisscrossing the skies over Oromia with devastating results for civilians in Oromia. So the atrocity crimes that were committed in Tigray in full view of the world were all committed in parts of Oromia, except the occasional reports by rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. The rest of the world chose to turn away. The atrocities in Oromia are not reported on. They're not known to the world. The Tigray war, which remained the forgotten war after Russia invaded Ukraine, has been remembered, and this fragile peace had been achieved. But in Oromia, the civil war in the theater remains hidden from the rest of the world. So that is the first thing that I really want to emphasize, that the war in Oromia is the hidden war. If the Tigray war was the forgotten war that was remembered eventually, the war in Oromia would be even more devastating if it's fought on the scale that was fought in Tigray, remains hidden from the rest of the world. My other point that I want to make is that I would like to underscore two major points about the hidden war in Oromia. First is that I would like to emphasize that the Ethiopian war started in Oromia and then shifted to Tigray. After keeping Western Oromia for almost more than a year under an illegal state of emergency command post that was declared in October 2018, with devastating consequences, the ENDF launched a full-scale, large-scale military campaign against the OLA in January 2020 in Wallagga region, and that is 10 months before the Tigray war started in November 2020. Now, this is not the first time, as I said, that region, some parts of Oromia had already been under a devastating command post rule for about more than a year. But this was a the first ENDF operation, large-scale operation, led directly by, at the time, General Branu Jula, who at the time was the Deputy Chief of Staff, but directly commanded by General Tesfaye Ayalo, who at the time was the Chief of Operations in the Deputy Chief of Staff's office, and now is the ENDF's Chief of Operation. This operation was a holistic and full-fledged war that was designed to last from January 8 to February 8, 2020. The objective was to wipe out, as they declared at the time, wipe out the OLA leadership, specifically targeting Jal Maro or Kumsa Riba and his lieutenants, and to dismantle the capacity of the OLA to mount any foreseeable challenge to the Ethiopian government. And I am actually speaking from what transpired in the discussions in the Ethiopian Defense Ministry. The secondary objective was to destroy Oromo nationalism by crushing it in Wallagga, which the Prime Minister and his counselors, military and civilian counselors, designated as the fount of the radical and extremist Oromo nationalism. Prosperity Party leaders decided that if Oromo nationalism is killed in Wallagga, it will subsequently die everywhere in Oromia. It's not something that I make up. This is really basically from the discussions that they had as they designed this operation for the first time. Now, once launched, the operation was conducted in total darkness, with no media allowed to report on it. Telephone lines were cut off, internet was disrupted, electricity discontinued. Something that we saw in Tigray actually was perfected in Oromia. And the operation was characterized by scorched earth tactics, that is burning down homes of alleged OLA sympathizers, preventing farmers from collecting their ripe crops, barring urban residents from traveling to rural areas and between towns. And many were rounded up because of guilt by association. That is, thousands, tens of thousands of young men were hauled to prisons, makeshift camps, kabale or precinct offices, and in private prisons suspected of having sympathies for OLA. And families of young men and women were suspected of joining OLA, were also subjected to collective punishment. Siblings and parents were either killed or imprisoned, and their homes ransacked and burned to the ground for failing to keep the family member at home. To do this, there were almost 8 divisions of the ANDF that were deployed in Wallagga alone in January 2020, and they remained there until the Tigray War broke out in 2020. Though most of the ANDF divisions left or diverted to Tigray when the Tigray War started, the Federal Police, Oromia Special Forces, Oromia Police, Amhara Fanno, Amhara Special Forces, Amhara Vigilantes, and the private armored groups created by officials to look and behave like the OLA continued the war in Oromia while war was raging in Tigray. This was happening particularly in Wallagga and in West and North Shawa and the Guji region in southern Oromia. After the Tigrayans evicted the ENDF out of Tigray, the seesaw turned in March 2021 to Oromia again. And during the lull in the Tigray war, the war continued in Oromia. 4 ENDF divisions that fought in Afar region were brought back to Wallagga in March 2021 to conduct another operation basically modeled after the January 2020 operation in terms of its objectives, its tactics, duration of conflict, and media blockouts. So just like the January 2020, the operation did not achieve its objectives. The OLA, far from being liquidated and its leadership completely beheaded, it actually grew in numbers and expanded its operations almost to the outskirts of Addis Ababa. Now, to repeat what I just said, that having perfected the brutality of the art of brutality in Wallagga and other parts of Oromia, the prosperity government turned its guns toward Tigray in November. So the war, basically the civil war, started in Oromia. The second point that I want to make about this, and I will be done fairly soon, is that in Oromia, the war was basically an enforced conflict. It was a matter of choice. And if I had time, I would go into the detail of it. But I have 2 reasons for making this assertion. That is, the first one is that the Oromo Liberation Front, the political organization that actually founded OLA, returned to Ethiopia in September 2018 to participate in peaceful struggle in the supposedly enlarged political space in Ethiopia. The Asmara agreement that the OLF reached with the federal government of Ethiopia provided, and this is really important, it provided for the termination of hostilities between the Ethiopian government and the OLA, desecuritization of politics and the peaceful political contestation. And to that end, both sides agreed to establish a joint OLF Ethiopian government committee to implement the agreement, especially the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the Ola. But the agreement was never implemented, and it would take me time to explain what that is. But that this was really, there was an opportunity to implement DDR at the time, but it was a choice of the Ethiopian government not to do so. That opportunity was missed. And secondly, various proposals to prevent the conflict were, by implementing the agreement on DDR, were reached. The first one was in the summer of 2018. The Oromia regional government sent a group of elders to meet with the OLA commanders to discuss the outstanding issues and to find ways to implement the Asmara agreement. Some of the elders groups managed to reach the territory at the time deemed part of the OLA stronghold in Kellam Walaga zone. And on their return, the elders group submitted a proposal to the government, which was dismissed and shelved without any action. Again, in November 2018, Jawar Mohammed and Bakala Garba traveled to Western Oromia. They held discussions with a large number of elders, religious leaders, and young people, including some OLA fighters. By the way, these were all televised in the two zones of Walaga. And upon their return, they presented a plan to the Oromia government officials and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces Supreme Command on the integration of Ola combatants into the Oromia and security forces. This was also not implemented. And again, in January 2019, Oromo Bagadas and Ha'asikes, business persons, intellectuals, and notable individuals launched a highly publicized reconciliation effort based on the conflict resolution mechanisms among the Oromo community. An agreement was reached in Finfinne. A 71-member technical committee was formed for DDR, but the way the returned OLA fighters and the 1,300 OLA recruits who had returned from Asmara were treated by the Ethiopian government all but destroyed any trust that the agreed upon DDR in Asmara or any other proposals would ever be implemented faithfully. Well, I thought that that was the end of it, but again, in May 2019, a fourth agreement was announced in the capital, this time with a big fanfare with the Oromia government officials, OLF leaders, and mediators in attendance. But nothing is known about what happened to that to that agreement. What is known is that once the announcement was basically followed by an escalation of military operation and tightening the command post administration and daily killing of innocent civilians, beating young people, and persecution of farmers and jailing of citizens. So this was a war of choice, basically. The war in Oromia could have been prevented if the Asmara agreement had been implemented faithfully and the various proposals were accepted. However, the government made a political calculation in which at the time, the Oromo Democratic Party, ODP, and its leader, the current incumbent prime minister, rejected or subverted all attempts to prevent the conflict because he made that political calculation that ODP must be the uncontested political hegemon in Oromia, otherwise they will lose power. This was a decision of the Central Committee of ODP. So to conclude, the war in Oromia is raging, not because, as the Prime Minister and his political acolytes repeatedly assert, that the OLA has no political objective or cohesive leadership or a desire for a negotiated settlement of political differences. OLA leaders insist that they're fighting this enforced war, this war of choice, because they have to fight. They feel that they have to fight for the rights of the Oromo and against the PP's quest to restore the worst aspects of Ethiopia's hideous autocratic legacies. So peace is possible if we return to previous agreements and learn from what happened in Tigray, that there is no winner in this war. It's not like the Biafra war where there was no victor and there was no vanquished. The war in Tigray the conclusion of the war in Tigray is being trumpeted as the 100% win of the Ethiopian government. But if the Ethiopian government decides to seek peace, it is in the tradition of the Oromo people to seek peace. For Oromo, Naga is the key to an orderly universe and a properly functioning self-reliant society. But it is a choice of the Ethiopian government to fight this war. So those are the 2 points that I just wanted to make.
Thank you so much, Professor Eskel Gabisa, for giving us an insight on what has been going on in Oromia as well. Hope we will have some questions later on if you stay with us a little bit after the following presentation. I hope Bonnie Holcomb and Bontu Galata are ready. They will be coming to give some recommendation. There is a bill that is going on in the U.S. Congress and Senate, H.R. 6600 and S 3199. This bill is the strongest bill that has come about regarding Ethiopia. And it will lay, based on our analysis, when we read the bill, it will have strong measures for democracy and peace and stability in Ethiopia. And so let me, if Bontu and Bonnie Holcomb are ready for their next presentation, and then we'll move to the Q&A thereafter. Bonnie?
Perfect. Ibisa, can you hear me?
Yes. Bontu, you ready?
Yes, ready.
Okay.
Perfect. And can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. My name is Bontu, and I am from the Union of Oromo Communities of Canada, and I'm on the Advocacy and Diplomacy team. And so I'm going to do a bit of a recommendation from our coalition, and then I'll pass it over to Bonnie to speak a little bit more. So as you see on this map, or the map that's in front of you here, is from the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The dark orange areas, majority in Walaga, are deemed inaccessible or very hard to access by humanitarian aid organizations, which makes it very difficult to determine actual numbers of displacement and support needed on the ground. And as noted by previous speakers, these areas are limited to the amount of communication due to the constant shutdowns of internet, electricity, and phone lines. So as a coalition, we strongly believe a shift in policy could correct the destructive directions of events in Ethiopia, to which the U.S. contributes to. If the U.S. determines the reverse direction, it can start by creating and pursuing targeted initiatives to undo damage and allow for investigation, reconciliation, growth, and goodwill. Real change will require intentionality, clear follow-up statements of direction, funding, staffing, and programming for other changes in the U.S. department itself. With that said, we have some recommendations as a coalition. So first, the impact will depend on conducting investigations to determine real conditions in the country to support informed policy decisions and to filter through the loads of disinformation in Oromia. Second, we strongly advocate for the U.S. to access or to assess their partnerships, both existing partners and identifying and developing new partners in the region, as well as analyzing their potential as forces of agency and committing to moving these new partners to center of outreach and development. Third, to demonstrate to the people of Africa that the U.S. reconsiders alliances with autocratic leaders and commit to democratic change, economic development, respect for human rights, and social equity by applying power and influence for practical support for peace building. And last but not least, we recommend the U.S. to initiate an arms embargo, specifically around drone weaponry to stop hostilities in Oromia. And I will pass it over to Bonnie to take over. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. We know that your time is exceedingly precious these days. This is the most important month for this Congress to try to pull through key elements that have been developed over the period of the 117th Congress and to make the difference that we have been preparing to make for some time through legislation. We are, as Bontu has put out, broad recommendations are part of our focus. But also we wanted to draw attention to the extent of information that we are aware is being ignored. Both Iskael, who made a very strong case for the hidden war, and Alex, who suggested the level of destruction that can go on behind the blackouts and the shuttering of regions that have been declared war zones. There are huge events occurring that the West and the United States, who has chosen to partner with Ethiopia, has no access to at all. Now, our team has put together this map of drone strikes, Fano militia and paramilitary attacks, and government shelling in regions since the time that the peace talks were proposed and while they were underway. We have recent information that just on the 1st of December, 42 people have been killed in an additional drone attack. We know that these are underway right now. Each one of we see the chart here, each one of these sites is an area where civilians have been put under the rain of bombs dropping from the sky, on the marketplaces, on the gatherings in church, on peaceful villages under just conducting their normal business, and also inside, especially in these areas in the center, inside towns, schools, institutions that are civilian places where civilians should feel safe. So the issue here is, what is required from the United States Congress? That subline and the tagline to our presentation today is, what can the U.S. Congress do for peace, to bring peace and stability? So we have just a general overview, is that you should be concerned about the crackdown on civil liberties and on the crackdown on life itself, the closing of the space that's been occurring. The bottom line is that basic rights and conditions that are being wiped out in areas that actually house the greatest populations in the second most populous country in the continent are really to be protected, restored, in order to be able to achieve what the U.S. strategies toward Africa has aspired to do, to bring a deeper bench of partners, to bring the conditions for democracy, and to restore a kind of order and stability. This announcement has been made publicly. People congratulate me all the time for the fact that there's now peace in Ethiopia. And what I know is that there is a major attack, assault, and destruction underway that is only going to escalate unless strong partners of the strong partners intervene to assist and to help reverse the course of this destruction. We know that the United States has ignored many opportunities for a reasonable and peaceful transition. We need to acknowledge that for 4 years, rights and conditions for democratic and peaceful work were supported and were yearned for and sacrificed for by the youth in the country. A widespread youth movement that existed across all of Oromia in areas where you have seen on this map, all the way through all of these regions and eventually joined by those of others, really were put forward in order to be included. They wanted to be accepted in their homelands. They understood that without democratic institution, democratic spaces, that their potential to be able to live a quality life was nearly non-existent. And the U.S. has assured youth and civil groups across Africa that it will support democracy. This is a whole different argument from what you usually hear about Ethiopia. The attacks that you see are attacks on populations that aspire to peace on their lands and were so strong that they brought down the previous government. The U.S. did not acknowledge that movement. It was and is a rising movement. We refer to this group as marginalized, but this is a majority group, actually better viewed as emerging against many barriers. Abiy Ahmed was elected from within the government that fought these youth and saw them as his biggest threat. He's announced in Central Committee meetings that the youth movement was his biggest threat, and the attacks you see on this map and that you hear about are escalated versions of the government's attempts to eliminate the emerging group of youth who had the potential and possibly could have the potential to be a catalyst for a democracy in this region. Where are these youth now? Iskael has referred to this. We can detail this, at least let's do a quick rundown. When the government crackdown began in 2019, first to revile and sideline them, calling them pestilence and dehumanizing them, the youth who had been the heroes were then came under attack, detained, fled the country, as Alex has pointed out, forcibly recruited to fight and die in the tens and hundreds of thousands, chased, dispersed, hibernated, joined the defense forces. They're not eliminated. The demise of determined and energetic youth cohort is a loss. It's a loss for the country. It's a loss that the United States cannot afford to sustain or contribute to. This country's youth are a potential partner, an engine of development for the future. And this region cannot rise to its potential together or separately without the youth being recognized, elevated, and in order to be elevated, they need to be seen, they need to be recognized. And U.S. mission and ambition in the region that are spelled out in the August policy documents and in preparations for the summits are to be able to stabilize the region. The treatment of the majority populations is something to attend to. Not only does this have a major national security implication, but major geopolitical implications as well. This region has destroyed, has really crippled the 6% that live in Tigray. 40% live in Oromia. 60% live in areas that are unseen and hidden. This is something to be taken into account. So the answer to the question, what can Congress do to bring peace and stability? There is legislation all ready to go. It was drafted over the end of last year, last December, revised in March. It passed committee on March 29th in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. With a few updates and streamlining, it can be brought to bear on this crisis situation to require investigations and to put policy on a solid footing, to see whether or not peace agreements are actually occurring, whether peace conditions are actually being put in place. this is a tool to use. So we are urging you to push it through, to pass through this final month of this session. We know we're urging those who are fatigued in looking at everything at the end of the year, but this could make an enormous difference in this country. We urge you to see the value of legislation that calls for access, above all, access to regions that are under attack, access to regions where false and disinformation has prevailed and has caused enormous suffering, access to know what needs to be done to make things right, to bring accountability, and to actually assess capacities for growth in the future. So Congress can put through this bipartisan legislation if there's not objection, and we need to actually look to see that a streamlined version could be acceptable. It will commit the U.S. to creating access and focusing on what is going on in the country. And then later, the U.S. needs to identify implementing partners that are actually capable of putting through reasonable investigations. They need to be neutral. They need to be savvy. The specific measures need to be put in place. So we're dealing with an authoritarian regime, and we know there are special pitfalls of bravado, of retaliation, of assertive misinformation and disinformation, but the stakes are high for those who need to be seen and heard and who have enormous potential. As I will point out again, the youth in this region need a signal from the United States. They need a signal that they are being seen and heard. And so do youth in the rest of the country, youth in the rest of the continent. What happens here has a lot of implication for youth across Africa as to what is it that the United States can do to make them look at their future with hope and their economic opportunities with a kind of embrace. So we're urging that what both Alex Duvall and Iskeel Gabissa have done is draw attention to the discrepancies between what is happening on the ground and what is actually being covered in the media and exposed to policy people. We're urging you to pass this legislation that would call the U.S. to build the capacity to step into the current breach and establish a solid basis for a transition to peace, stability, and building toward democracy. So that is our underscore, our immediate urgent recommendation and appeal. And we are very pleased to have both of our speakers underscore the value of this. At that point, I will revert to our moderator and thank you, Ebisa, for proceeding with the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, and Bontu, thank you for that wonderful recommendation and insight on we can't emphasize enough how critical this bill is with the support of everyone. I think it will open up a foundation for democracy and peace in Ethiopia. The legislation has some strong measures and a strong tendency to hold those accountable. So thank you so much. Let's proceed. There are few questions that we have received. If we have Professor Iskeel and Alex Duvall present, let me just summarize some of the questions that came. For Alex Duvall, maybe both. What do you, is Professor Alex Duvall with us? I'm not able to see my screen.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you so much. You have been studying the region, especially Ethiopia, for a very long time. What do you wish policymakers here, Congress staffers, should have known or should know at this point in order for them to advocate for a policy that encompasses the entire Ethiopia, than specific regions? So where do you see some discrepancies between what's going on the ground, what the people want, and the disconnect here on some of the foreign policies of the United States?
Well, I think the main thing is that we have had under the previous administration of the Trump administration, there was really no interest in democracy, neither at home nor abroad. And what we saw was a delegation of discretionary power over US policies or US actions towards the Horn of Africa, delegation to 4 states in the Middle East: Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And it was their priorities and their mode of politics, their very transactional mode of politics, of what I call the political marketplace, delivering money in exchange for often very personal loyalties, that actually ran the show, not only in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, Sudan, Somalia as well. The Biden administration has pushed back slightly against that, but still we see those Middle Eastern powers having a very powerful role. And we have an administration that has an Africa policy, which is really not a policy at all. It's a policy of saying, we believe in stability, but we have other priorities around the world, and we are not going to invest any diplomatic effort or capital, and we're not going to use the tools that we have at our disposal to promote human rights, democracy, justice, things that we might assume that the US believes in. So there's essentially a non-policy, and it's been very shocking to see this in action in Sudan, in Ethiopia, where the US allows itself to be frightened into a corner. Intimidated is too weak a word, by the merest hint that Abiy would turn to Russia or China. And of course, it's nonsense. Neither Russia nor China has anything that can match the US tools of international policy, especially in the economic sphere. And this government, this administration, especially the State Department, is simply not willing to use those tools. And I think it's a shocking derogation of responsibility.
Thank you so much. And another question for Professor Eskel is, who do you think had benefited from this war? We understand that the war being fought, maybe Abiy trying to control, but is there an ideological drive? The war on Oromia, the war on Tigray, is there an idea that's continue to bring about stability, war? Who do you think have benefited at the end of this? Well, right now, as the war is going on, who had benefited, and what could be associated with? Is there an ideological framework to this war? But if you catch my meaning there.
I kind of appreciate the idea that this is this war, the Tigray war, and a lot of people focus on the Tigray war, and I try to explain my thinking about what's going on in Ethiopia, that it is a civil war with multiple theaters of operation. It's the same war over the same issues. I think the structural factors, like it's a border dispute between Amhara and Tigray, or it's an ideological war between federalists and anti-federalists. It's a clashing dream between unitarists and federalists or constitutionalists. It's a failure of state building. I think all of these are there, but all of this could have been prevented. All of this could have been negotiated. Lately, the Prime Minister, as was said earlier, that the Prime Minister has come out as a defender of the constitution, which he had been thrashing in his words and in his deeds. The decision that triggered this civil war grew out of the prime minister's belief that he could demonize his opponents, particularly the TPLF and the OLF, in the eyes of their respective communities, that he could deploy the Ethiopian military to the extent of grounding down his opponents militarily, that he could brutalize their supporters sufficiently to the point that they would turn against the TPLF and OLF, or his belief that he could bribe and buy off the elites of both communities through financial largesse. I mean, these are all his ideas. That's what the cause of the war is. It's the person, the choice that he makes, and now he has established a personalist rule in Ethiopia that he thinks that he is able to realize the goal of recreating a unitary state with a centralized political system, with an autocrat at its pinnacle of power, that he really believes in it, and he believes that the Lord is behind him, and this is reinforced day in and day out by his religious advisors that he could do all of this. All of these are there. All of the problems that you just said are there, but with another leader, with a leader that understands himself, understands Ethiopia, and understands the limits of power, all of this work could have been prevented. But who benefited from this? No one benefited from this. From what I heard from the military theaters in the north, I think the numbers that I've heard about Marshal Brano Jula blurting out in an unguarded moment about 136, but I think what I've heard is much more than that. It's a total of about 350,000 killed in the recent round from the Amhara region, from the Eritreans, and from the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. The whole infrastructure in Tigray is beyond repair right now. In Wallagga and other places, there was no harvest collected for the last 3 or 4 years. There is an emerging green famine in Wallagga. Ethiopia has now become or accused of perpetrating ethnic cleansing and genocide, possibly genocide, and other forms of atrocity crimes in the context of war. And I cannot see, and Ethiopia has basically lost its military. It's a hollowed out military that exists right now. So if a state doesn't have a military, security apparatus, an economy that could sustain the state, and the state is unable to govern, and people are being killed everywhere, there is no security, no one benefits from continued carnage. So I don't think anybody could benefit from continued war, but as long as there is someone who believes that the brutality alone, just being more brutal than previous Ethiopian governments, could achieve the goal of restoring the political system that was abandoned 50 years ago, as long as someone believes that, this is likely to continue. So I don't know if anybody benefits from utter distraction, death, and mayhem and displacement anywhere in the world. So no one benefits, and even the restoration of the old order is not possible. It's not going to happen. So it's a lose-lose situation, Dr. Ebisa.
Thank you so much. I don't know how much more time we have. Okay. Okay. Am I being heard? our timekeeper, I don't know how much time we have left, but there is one more question that came about, and then I'll give to Bonnie for closing summary on this. Maybe this could be directed to both of you, Professor Isgail and Alex DeWall. There are many analysts that believe the country is now on the verge of Ethiopia is on the verge of disintegration. There's a lot of fragmentation in the country. If this war, and especially continues in Oromia and other southern states, and the continual attack on the federal structure, which had given the people of Ethiopia hope of staying together, if this war continues, do you see that the stability of the country or Ethiopia being exacerbated? And you also had mentioned America's tremendous influence and has some tools to act on to bring about stability in Ethiopia. Could you get into that a little bit for us? And my moderator or timekeeper, how much time do we have? I know we have people present.
We have about 13 minutes left.
13 minutes, okay. Okay, let me give the floor to Professor Alex DeWall.
So thank you, yes. 3 quick points. The first is in response to the question of who gains. Arguably, there is one individual who is gaining, and that is U.S Africa, who is remaining relevant and not facing serious challenge. And we know what he has done to Eritrea, and he is now doing that to Ethiopia too. The second is I think on pretty much every index, Ethiopia is a failed state. And the reason why it does not appear as such is, I think, a combination of the sort of the habitual deference of many highlanders to the idea of a state, and a sort of collective denial among the diplomatic community about what has happened. And this sort of extraordinarily naive idea that somehow Abiy is at heart a reformer, progressive, and if we just give him the chance, he will put everything back on track, you know. And I don't need to tell you how naive that is. So if Ethiopia really actually has sadly, you know, failed as a state, you know, what is the way forward, and what can the US in particular do about it? Well, I think the US has a lot more influence generally than it is prepared to acknowledge, particularly on the economic side. It has a lot of hard power in terms of not only its own instruments of sanctions and assistance, but also its de facto veto at the World Bank and the IMF. But also it does have soft power. And one of, I think, the few encouraging signs at the moment is the emergence of a consensus in Kenya between, you know, the outgoing president and the new president about the fact that Kenya needs to play a leading role in the region. And Kenya doesn't have a lot of hard power, but it has soft power. It is the one place where civil society and democracy really is flourishing in the region. So I think, and I think there's also something to learn from the Somalis, who have really, you know, if you want to see how to manage a failed state, the Somalis have become very good at it. And so there are some lessons to be learned from how Somalis turned away from the specter of autocracy that was looming over them a year ago by the rejection of Farmajo and the return of Hassan Sheikh Mohammed. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Professor Scout, we have a few minutes, but if you could add, if you have anything to add to this. If the war continues, for instance, unabated, can Ethiopia afford another war on Oromia, in the largest region in Ethiopia?
Okay, maybe 3 points. A measure that is searching to antagonize Tigray, the foundation, the historical foundation of Ethiopia, and Oromia at the same time. Oromia, the geographic, economic, and demographic center of Ethiopia. It's from the very beginning is likely to tear the country asunder, and that's basically what is happening. Why the PP government chose to do that? Well, only Abiy knows. Second, what happened in Pretoria is an agreement on the cessation of hostilities, basically simply to stop the war, and in the Nairobi protocols or how to proceed to disarm Tigray and disengage and disarm. The fundamental causes, reasons that the country went into that civil war, they have not been addressed. They've not been addressed. They kicked the can down the road, and I don't know how it's going to be addressed under Abiy Ahmed's leadership, and that's what the international community is saying. It's the issue of Oromia, for instance, is an internal matter that had to be dealt within the context of Ethiopia. But the very foundation, the reason that this civil war broke out is the fact that Abiy and his party and his supporters are trying to do the impossible of restoring Ethiopia. And the third thing is that the social fabric that holds this country together has been frayed. The political settlement of 1991 that prevented war for 30 years had been abrogated. So there is really nothing to base on to say that this country would continue. Maybe if the description for that is a failed state, that is probably what it is. But one more point about Isaias, I've heard two people who heard from Isaias himself in Asmara that his goal is basically to destroy Ethiopia by continuing the fight in Ethiopia. As long as he has this goal, and the Amhara expansionists maintain their idea that they could create a greater Amhara by taking up land away from Tigray, Western Tigray, Southern Tigray, Wallagga, Shawa, and other places, including Finne. I don't know how you can come together, that this war is likely to continue.
Thank you very much. Appreciate both of you for your insight and well-articulated presentation. And I hope the policymakers will take note of some of these nuances and complex problem in Ethiopia and direct U.S. foreign policy to encompass the entire Ethiopia and listen to all sides and have all relevant information on their side. And we will do on our part to provide an accurate representation of Ethiopia on the country. If Bonnie is available for us to do closing remark, the floor is yours. Once again, thank you everyone who had come to present, to join us on this webinar.
Thank you, Ebisa. I am very pleased to extend my appreciation also, and on behalf of this coalition, which has 11 organization members, to Professor Escale, who is becoming a foremost spokesperson on Oromo issues in the public sphere, and we're very grateful to him for the work that he does to continue to keep abreast of all the moving parts that affect this region. And Alex Duvall, you have been a very important voice. You are trusted in many circles, and we are grateful for your insights and for your thoughtfulness. And we look forward to broadening this discussion to include those who are in the room who are policy, think tank, congressional decision makers, to hear what we're saying here and to realize that the tools that would begin this process of grounding U.S. policy in a different, in reality and in light of conditions on the ground are in our hands. Congress can make a difference. The United States can find implementation mechanisms for its very aspirational U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And we encourage, above all, investigation, confirmation of what we've been saying, hear our appeal to see that the people who are reaching out to us as advocates, who are reaching and those who are on the ground, who see glimpses of what is the level of suffering and indescribable atrocities raining down on people who are innocent of any malfeasance. Go listen, talk, open the door, create access so that we can move into a different, we can shift to a different future. So we are planning to repeat and to develop further arguments on Tuesday. Sena Jimjimo has a very good presentation on humanitarian crisis in the South. Trevor Truman, a background to how we got here. Others who are going to be presenting further detail than we were able to present today. We thank you, and I look forward to working with all of these various groups in the future. We all do.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to send my thanks to Alex and Ezekiel as well.